Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and tonight I'm going to talk briefly about bringing clean water into the home. And it is quite an interesting topic, as most things are in history, because if you turn back the clock, our earliest ancestors, let's say our Stone Age and even our Bronze Age and Iron Age ancestors, would have literally collected water from numerous water sources. So that would have included a spring if they were lucky enough to live somewhere near a spring. We are quite lucky in Worcester because we've got several springs that are often dried up now, actually, unless it's really, really wet weather. And obviously towards the Malverns, including the Malvern Hills, there is a number of springs there, which is one of the reasons why Malvern began as a spa town, very much like places like Bath, for example, or even Droitwich. So if we're lucky, we've got relatively clean water, but you have to remember clean water has to be collected close to the source, because obviously if you're going to collect water further away from where it's bubbling out of the ground, it could become contaminated in one way. Now, in modern standards, that could mean contaminated with fertilizers and pesticides, whereas at that time in history, including the Stone Age, that could mean a dead woolly mammoth, for example, further up near the spring. So you've got to be very, very careful. But spring water would have been a great source if they could get it. When we start getting settlements, we know for a fact that most settlements begin near to springs, because obviously people realise the importance of getting fresh water. It's something that we have to remember to do even in modern time. The only big difference now is we're lucky because we've just got to turn the tap on and we get clean water. We then get, interestingly, the Romans taking everything a step further. And famously, I keep on mentioning this, the Romans improved what we have already. And one of the most famous things the Romans were doing was culverting water, and if need be, creating things like the aqueduct, which is one of the things they're famous for. Now, I've got a picture of an aqueduct here, and this is quite an extreme case. Basically, you've got spring water, you need to bring it into Rome, for example, so you build a grand aqueduct like this one. And you have to remember, things like this, big building projects like this, were often done to show the power of the emperor. For example, I can bring clean water. It's another interesting story that the Romans often saw clean water as a civilized thing, which is why even in some films you often see people going, would you like a glass of water? And I've used the word glass because they had it, and I've also used the term water because even though wine was drank along with ales and things like that, water was seen as an important thing to show a civilized society. So the Romans would build things like this, and they did it in Britain as well. Not on such a grand scale, but we know they often culverted springs, for example, and channeled them to where they wanted to go. Now, if you look through our playlist for Hadrian's Wall, you will see when we talk about some of the forts, for example, the Romans built large stone culverts and stone drains to channel water where they needed it to go, including being able to fill up bathhouses and flush out their toilets as well. So they were very good at manufacturing and putting the water where they need to. Then what we have is the early medieval period. So once the end of the Roman Empire takes place, we've then got the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes, that sort of era, what we used to call the Dark Ages. And a lot of the monasteries that were starting to get built, and this is pre-Norman conquest, were starting to use that older technology, probably because it was still kicking around and the books were there, so they could read through old Latin Roman texts and they could see how they made use of the landscape moving water around. Now, famously, when we get to the height of the Middle Ages, we know for a fact that you have monasteries setting up some fantastic water courses. I've seen quite a few of them across Britain, including, if you think of Worcester Cathedral, if you go into the cloister area, there are stone troughs, and they would have been lead lined originally, and there is still evidence of the lead there, and that would have channeled spring water straight through the monastery. So they had fresh spring water permanently for washing, drinking and cooking, and that's what they're using it for, really. The only problem is, by the medieval period, because there are more and more people living, and there's more and more waste matter, and we're talking human waste, animal waste, and just generally rubbish belonging to human beings, we then get a lot of water sources getting contaminated. And that's when we get a lot of illness. But the weird thing is, by the Middle Ages, as it had been throughout history, people always associated alcohol being safer to drink than the water. We know the science behind it today, and that's down to the fact that they're boiling up the water, and that kills a lot of the bacteria. If you go back to the Middle Ages, they didn't see that. All they saw is people drank alcohol, like the ales and the beers, the ciders, the perries, and they lived. But strangely, anyone drinking the water, it was green, it was brown, there was things floating in it, there was things swimming in it. They died pretty much straight away. A horrible illness, actually. They would have had stomach pains, they would have been throwing up, they would have had explosions in their underpants, as I always call it, and then eventually would have died a horrible death, all caused by waterborne diseases. And you have to remember, in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of rats around as well, and we know a lot about rats today, that they are incontinent and they have a habit of going to the toilet everywhere, which can lead to all sorts of illnesses. But people did make attempts at creating clean water, and therefore the easiest option, the safest option really, was to drop in a well. Now, wells have been around for a long time. We know the Romans used them as well, but I'm talking about them here because by the time you get to the medieval period, they're becoming quite popular to find good sources of clean water. Now, sometimes there were literally holes in the ground and people would drop a bucket down on a rope and pull the water back up and then carry it to their homes and their settlements, usually using something like a yoke. I haven't brought one of those in tonight, but I do have one. But there we have a very simple well in a drawing here, and this one is not like the old wishing well that you'd all expect to find. This is more of a hole in the ground. It's got a wooden top on it. You've got a lid on it to keep anything from falling down there, like livestock, for example, and that will contaminate the water. And we've got a very simple pulley system or a windlass at the top to lower a bucket, a communal bucket, up and down. And that was quite a popular thing. And that was our water source for hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards, really. Eventually, someone came up with the idea of fitting a pump to the top. So basically, you cap off the well and you fit some ironwork. And we have another picture of one of those here. So there's not a big difference between that and what you've just seen. The only difference is now, by pushing the handle up and down, pulling the handle up and down, you're actually drawing the water up through the lead pipework and then squirting it out through the actual tap on there. You'll also notice, hopefully, on the spout there is a little hook. That's so you can hang your bucket on it, so you can actually use both hands on the handle. This was a communal job a lot of the time, so you'd have people come together and use these, and it was quite a common job for children to send them off for water. And remember, water was needed for brewing, because most people brewed at that period of time. It was used for washing, because remember, people did wash years ago. And it was used for cooking, which is the main job of water at the time. Now, some people by the Victorian era were actually using these illegally. And when I say illegally, Helen does a very good talk about food adulteration. And one of the things a lot of people used to do was take milk, sometimes not very good quality milk, milk that was on the turn, as they often say, and then they would top it up with water. And they would top it up with water literally to make it go further and to water it down and take a lot of the curdling that's going on in it. And that's one of the reasons why this had a fantastic name, a name that I actually think is absolutely brilliant. And that was sometimes known as the milk or the cow with the iron tail. And I think that's really good, because that, in a way, is like the cow and that's like its tail. And when you work that, you will get in the equivalent of milk, so water, the cow with the iron tail. Now, by the Victorian era, a lot of those were actually being contaminated, and that's down to the fact that technology was changing and we were starting to dig holes in the ground for our toilets as well. If you get a chance, look through the playlist and you will find a potty history of toilets and toilet paper, and in there we talk about toilets. And it's interesting that when they are sinking toilet holes into the ground, they're actually going into the same level of the water table as the wells. So obviously you're going to get a lot of cross contamination, and we get a lot of that across Britain, but also in Worcester, and you hear some horrifying stories of that. There was that many problems at one point. People were getting cholera. There was major cholera epidemics in Britain. And what we have to remember is these water sources were not always on. And people often think, well, it's always on, it's a well, it will always fill up, the handle's always there. But when I say they're not always on, the authorities, the corporations, the councils often took the handle away, and that was to stop it being used 24 hours a day or being wasted, for example. They would have also taken it when the well water was very, very low, and sometimes without taking the handle away, they often chained the handle down. So they attached a chain and a padlock to stop it being used. Now, famously, we do have a story of Dr. Snow. Before we knew where cholera was coming from, Dr. Snow was starting to map where cases of cholera were happening. He found that certain water pumps were seeing large concentrations of people with cholera. So he did a bit of a map, and he could sort of narrow down which water source was causing it. And it was from that moment, especially with the moment when he chained it shut to stop people using it, he suddenly realised the cases stopped. And obviously that led to the well-known story of finding that cholera was a waterborne illness. And it's quite an interesting one. But even into the 1900s, this was the norm for a lot of people. Even in the First World War, especially in rural areas, even into the 1940s and 50s, that was the norm for most people. However, with the Victorian era, with the cholera epidemics, there was a lot of call for water, clean water to be given to people, and better quality ways of moving it and managing it, really. And you do see in the 19th and 20th centuries very good documentation in council records looking at better water sources. We've got some fantastic ones for Worcester, for example, including showing where drains and where sewer systems and where water pumps were going to be added, and how they were going to stop them being contaminated. And the thing with that, most pipes originally, especially in the medieval period for moving water around, were either lead or wood, and by this period, sort of the Victorian and 20th century, it was lead. That's one of the reasons why we get the word plumb or plumber, because it actually comes from the Latin word for lead. That's where it comes from. Look it up. But like I said, 19th and 20th century, there was a bigger call for water. And you have to remember, people are also starting to think that cleanliness is next to godliness. So obviously clean water, civilized world, civilized empire, washing more, washing clothes more, access to clean water, healthy living is becoming the norm. And this is a fantastic story. I think I've showed it before, showing sinks starting to appear, and you see sinks and basins starting to appear in the big houses, so they don't need to go out and collect water. It was now plumbed, literally plumbed into their homes. A turn of a tap will create water. It's an interesting one as well, because when it started to go into normal houses, especially in the 20th century, most of the time you only had water on the ground floor. So you would have a sink in your kitchen, and that's where your water was. It's extremely rare to have water upstairs. And remember, people are using an outdoor toilet or an outhouse, sometimes just a hole in the ground that the soil fell into, until sewers came along. And in some areas you didn't get sewers put in for a very long period. So many cases the water was literally on the downstairs, so you would have to take water upstairs, and that's why you have basins in ewers going upstairs for washing in the bedroom, for example. Anyway, by the middle and towards the end of the 20th century, obviously clean water was normal. Water pumps were pretty much eradicated. They started to become more of a feature in a town. You do see them in towns today. You also see them in the countryside, in pubs, for example, outside. It's just a feature and nothing more. And then eventually, obviously, we get the modern plumbing put in. And obviously the big thing now is we're changing a lot of the old ceramic water pipes in Britain, especially in Worcester. They've been doing that for ages now, replacing them with plastic, for example. So therefore, you're not likely to get problems with it in the future. And then famously, post-war, we know for a fact that nowadays they put all sorts of things in water, so you get fluoride and so on, and it cleans the water, and that's actually much better for our teeth as well. And if you look at the statistics, the teeth of modern people is much better now with things like fluoride in the water than it was in the olden days. But as I always say, if you have a glass of water, you must always think how lucky we are, because years ago, collecting water was hard work. Can you imagine needing water for a saucepan to cook your potatoes in, for example? You have to get that water, and then if you go further back, join in the queue at the well to get some water that could be contaminated, and then obviously further back than that, literally go into the river or stream and take in river and stream water, unless you are lucky enough to have a spring nearby. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed that video. Keep sending us messages on what you would like to see in the future. We've got quite a list forming, and we will go through them bit by bit over time. And make sure you subscribe. So on that note, have a safe end of the weekend, shall we say, really. Stay in, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.